Will the number of days for LSA levels be decreasing? Stick around and find out. Hey everyone, and welcome to The Savvy Squaddy. This is episode 2 of the conversation that I had with the Pay, Pension and Allowances policy leads. This near 14-minute chat covers the topic of allowance, from LSA, day subsistence, to get you home. Many questions are answered and context provided, which will certainly be of value to you. I started out by asking Will, what is LSA?
Yeah, perfect. Great question. Thanks for having us today, Cameron. So, Longer Separation Allowance, or LSA, as everyone will know it by. What I'm probably going to talk about is what it is, go into the qualifying separation criteria, a couple of facts on LSA, and then what everyone's golden question is how much will I receive? And then open to any questions on it, because it is an allowance that every single person, regardless of rank, is entitled to, should they meet the criteria. So it's really, really valued by our people. And as James was talking about, what we don't want to do with LSA is at any time compromise X factor of pay, because that is probably arguably the thing we wish to try and protect more so over a short-term allowance. So both the pay team in MOD main building and the allowances teams make sure that any enhancements or reviews of the two aspects, we sort of do that cross-cutting work to make sure it's protected. So what is LSA? So if you've never heard about it before, it's a payment to support and improve retention, and it's by compensating for the separation over and above that, which is compensated for by X factor within your basic pay. So it tries to recognise the disadvantage of separation caused when you can't return to your duty station and or the family home. Now, that could either be by the nature or location of the duty that the military puts you on. And so some sort of qualifying separation at the moment is defined as 7 consecutive days or more of INVOLSEP, so involuntary separated service, that is taken at a location that obviously, as I said, you can't get back to your duty station, family home, or your permanent residence during what people will consider normal stand-down periods. So that could be, for an example, weekends or some leave or wherever it may be. But there is a caveat to this that makes it even sweeter, I think, for people, is that if, however, field conditions are declared for a period of temporary duty away, then LSA will be paid from day one in 24-hour blocks, and that's all based on assessing the situation at 0300 hours each day. But what I would stress is it's paid from midnight to midnight, so people should try to remember that when they're trying to calculate their days away. And there are other several unique circumstances where LSA is also paid. I mean, this can include hospitalisation, some overseas designated LSA areas. So that is more down to how do we incentivise people to go to some of these really remote and strategically important locations. And Belize is just one example of that. And then there's some on-the-road posts, and for those that are unaccompanied whilst on a permanent overseas assignment. So there is some funnies in there, but generally, what should people take away? It's 7 days, unless you're on field conditions, and then that's usually paid from day one of when you deploy, based on the field conditions elements. LSA does attract a personal liability for income tax and national insurance contributions, but that all happens automatically, so people don't need to worry about that when it comes to self-assessment tax returns. And just to show you, how much it's valued by the Army and how busy we are, last year's financial readout was £62 million on LSA, and that will obviously flex and wane depending on activity levels or the number of exercises that are being executed or how people are being employed. So often people ask, how much will I receive? Well, it's paid at different levels. And I know, Cameron, you had a really good question from one of your followers on, will the required days for each level of LSA ever be lowered? Well, I'll just explain the levels and then a bit of the history as to why it's actually at a really good stage now in terms of the number of days for qualifying between each level. So LSA level 1 is paid for the first 280 days of qualifying separation, and then levels will increase every 180 days after that up to level 13, and then it changes slightly again after that. But rates received a 5.8% uplift in the latest pay award, and it's another thing that's considered by AFPRB. So it's that important that a 4-star organisation such as the AFPRB take it into account because of how valuable it is to our people and the circumstances they go through. So that actual increase has taken level 1 LSA to £8.35 per day and level 5 to £20.97 per day. So ever so slightly increasing, and it will be taxed depending on your tax level. However, it is considered additional income and compensatory. And we use that word all the time in the allowances business about whether it's compensatory, and therefore most of them are taxed, and then contributory, which is, you would expect to pay some form of contribution in a circumstance, and therefore that would be tax-free. I said I was going to talk about the levels. So back in the day, I'll give the history of why we're in a really good place at the moment. So in April 2009, the qualifying interval between levels, except for level 1 to 2, reduced from 300 to 240 days. And level 1 was actually set at 340 days. And really, to give you even more context, the 100-day initial qualifying period removed in 2007 was added to that 240-day interval. So in 2009, it started to get better. And then in April 12, the qualifying interval between levels was reduced to 180 days. And that's when they set level 1 at 280. And as I said, 180 thereafter. So lots of improvements around that time, that we were probably in the height of Afghanistan, to recognise the impact of LSA on our people. And so at the moment, it would be speculation for me to say whether those levels would reduce even further, but there are no planned significant reviews of the LSA levels at this stage, because they are deemed, very appropriate for the amount of activity that we currently undertake as an army. But never say never, and we'll see what the future brings. Cameron, is that a good blast on LSA? Would you like to ask me anything on it?
I mean, yeah, that was very in-depth. It was good to know actually some of the history and how high the days used to be, and how it's definitely been dropped and it's much more accessible to a lot more people. I do have one. So I found out about that 7 days having to be, away from home or from your duty station. I found out sort of the hard way, where I came back from an 8-day overseas trip and I didn't get any LSA. And when I found out, obviously that's when I was told that it was 7 days. And that doesn't include travel days, does it? So if I fly the Monday and then come back the following whichever day, it's the 7 days in country or you are away from, because with travel days, you're still, I suppose you've still been at your duty station or at home within that 24-hour period. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, I think every scenario, you need to look at, when you leave. Let's say you leave on a Monday morning, the ticker won't start until midnight that Monday. So there's nothing in policy that talks about travel days, but the reality of travelling out and back in has the same effect. So if you left at, say, 10:00 on a Monday morning and returned the Sunday in the morning, both of those day periods either side wouldn't count, because it's not 24-hour blocks. So therefore you're only going to hit midnight Monday through to late midnight Saturday, and therefore that wouldn't be the qualifying period. So that's probably the reality of what you've experienced there.
Yeah.
But if you can count on your trip from midnight to midnight in blocks, in full day blocks, I would probably go and ask your unit HR to reassess if it hits the number 7.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Thank you. And then in terms of people who go up on courses, and whilst they are off duty or able to go home on the weekend, because of the location of the course, it is not, really practical for them to go home, because it would be, either really let's spend all Friday driving and then have to leave early Sunday. Is there scope, or does it need to be put into the JIs or something, for that example, for them to then get LSA?
Well, my immediate stretch is, or where my mind goes to, is to do a get you home travel. So if I get pinged on a course and I have the weekend off, then my get you home travel would kick in to get me back to my duty station. Let's say if I lived in single living accommodation, as one example, then that would be a qualifying address, providing I was there for the 10-day period on a course. But LSA and get you home travel cannot be paid concurrently. So I would think that if you are stood down on a Friday and it may be a long drive, the system would deem it reasonable that you could get back to your family home or your duty station on the stand down periods. So yeah, you aren't precluded by the system from returning, so that let's say wouldn't kick in.
Yeah, but they could be, get you home would be the alternative.
Yeah, it would be, providing you then hit all the get you home travel criteria as well.
Yeah. Cool. So I suppose the next question was, what was the issue with, was it LSA during Op INTERFLEX last year?
Yeah, we had a unit on Op INTERFLEX that were being bussed daily from their barracks to Salisbury Plain training area, delivering training with very, very little downtime. And the question, the absolute understandable question that came from the chain of command and the troops is, well, how is this not LSA qualifying criteria? And this is probably a really good example of how where we couldn't compromise the eligibility criteria of LSA in fear of doing something to X factor. And so long hours and separation is factored in to X factor. But LSA is then basically your next marker. And because these people were returning back to their duty station every day, and it seems brutal for me to say, because some of these people are only getting 3, 4, 5 hours of downtime, either with their family or in the block, and getting some sleep and then straight back up again. That is a brutal routine for people. It didn't fit the criteria for LSA. Now, instead of amending criteria for LSA, the advice from head office back down was that the setup and resourcing of that exercise, or that operation, should I say, should have been adjusted on Salisbury Plain. And because if you're a unit that comes down from CABRIT to deliver training, you cannot feasibly go home in the 3 or 4 hours, and therefore you are accommodated on Salisbury Plain or wherever it may be to deliver this training. So you do get LSA, and so I think, as much as that was painful for the chain of command to see that LSA couldn't be opened up to these individuals, other ways of trying to give people maybe stand down at the end of this commitment or whatever it may be was, and maybe even which units are on the chopping board for it, was a discussion going on at the highest levels. So that hopefully gives a bit of context on the INTERFLEX. It certainly wasn't a computer says no, it's people being difficult, but X factor at large needed to be protected rather than compromising the eligibility criteria of LSA.
That's really good. Thanks for mentioning that, because I think that's some important context. Not a lot of people would understand the implications of it. It's not always just a simple fix. There's so much more nuance that goes into a lot of these decisions. And like you say, it's not just people wanting to mess over other people. There are genuine reasons why things can't be done. But I suppose moving on, LSA in terms of like when you go overseas for sports, is that a thing?
So, in essence, no. Okay, so service personnel are ineligible for LSA on any period spent away from the duty station for the purposes of sport or sort of sponsored organised recreational activities, and this does include enablers and coaches or managers. We've had a couple of questions in over the last couple of months about, I'm organising an overseas sports visit and I'm the manager. I should be addressed as a key enabler, similar to how we talk about those on AT expeditions. But the policy is very, very clear that it's for those expeds and AT, and that form of training has passed muster with HMRC. Sport is a no-no for this, because what that will do is compromise LSA as a whole. So it needs to be quite watertight with that, Cameron, and hopefully the policy change in the last few months is pretty clear on that.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting actually. In like LSA seems to be quite a big thing in terms of, as it was said earlier by James, it's that balancing act of not wanting it to compromise the X factor, which I think again a lot of people probably never understood or gathered that context. So it's really good to hear you kind of lay that out. At the start of when you were talking about LSA, you sort of said it was for everyone. Can reservists also get it?
Yeah, they can. We get a lot of reservists who volunteer to help out on significant exercises, alongside their regular counterparts. And some people get mixed messaging, and we understand that. There's rumour mill out there. There's lots of word of mouth stuff that people take as the genuine truth, and people say, "Oh, am I eligible? But am I not?" But members of the reserve forces, not cadet force adult volunteers, but the members of the reserve forces will be eligible LSA in line with regular counterparts, but it is dependent on how they're employed. So it's really specific, and there's been some good clarification work has gone on with the Army team here, is that the reservists are only eligible for LSA if they're serving under the terms of Section 24 FTRS or Section 25 ADC, and that's all to do with the Reserve Forces Act 96. So if reservists are undertaking any periods of training under their obligatory training, which is Section 22, or the VTOD, Section 27, they are ineligible. So it all comes down to how they are being employed on particular exercises rather than the exercise itself, as one example. And the exception to that is we rely heavily as a military on our reserve key enablers to do with expeds and adventurous training. So where they are those key enablers and an instructor who, the activity overseas, let's say on AT, is absolutely, if they don't attend, the activity falls down, that would be what the chain of command would deem a key enabler, and so they would get LSA for those purposes as well. Hopefully clear.
And for reservists who are eligible for LSA, I suppose the levels are the same as the regular counterparts?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And so I suppose we'll nip it in the bud there for LSA. I think we answered quite a lot of the questions, and hopefully a lot of the listeners have gained value out of what you've said, Will, so thank you. If we move on to Ian with day subsistence, with the cost of living and inflation, and we're all feeling it in the pockets, why is day subsistence, why is that still £25?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. So I guess before I talk about the current rate of DS, if I just quickly give a very quick overview and set a bit of context behind what we mean by subsistence. So effectively, it's allowance to reimburse for actual expenditure within limits. What do we mean by subsistence? It's anything such as prepared food, drink, necessary personal expenditure, and temporary accommodation occurred whilst travelling on duty. It's actually broken down to three elements. Some people don't know this, but we've got night subsistence, which is normally costs for overnight accommodation and breakfast. You've then got day subsistence, which is clearly your question was about. And then we've got something called incidental expenses, the criteria of which have been narrowed over recent years, but that only really applies now when you're hospitalised overnight as an inpatient, and it covers items such as laundry, newspaper, TV, internet access, and stuff like that. So let's focus on day subsistence, as clear that's what your question is about. So this is the reimbursement of actual receipted costs up to a limit, and we'll talk about the limit in a minute, for expenditure necessarily incurred for food and drink, but that doesn't include alcohol, so that's an important point to note, during the day for periods of over 5 hours, so more than 5 hours away from your permanent or temporary duty station, where you can't get access to a pay-as-you-dine meal if you pay-as-you-dine unit, or for an entitled casual meal at a non-pay-as-you-dine unit. In terms of the rate, this was reduced to £25 per day. It was previously £26 something back in 2010 as a result of Strategic Defence and Security Review, so SDSL 10, and effectively it was a cost-saving measure, and it's been frozen at that rate now since 2011. So this was a conscious decision by Defence, and it is purely based on affordability to freeze it at that rate. So to get onto your question now, £25 DS is not enough for our people, for them to, buy their prepared meals away from their duty station. So as already mentioned, frozen £25 based on affordability. Just to set that into context, the Army has an annual spend of about £20 million on subsistence for its people. And whilst we can't identify how much is spent on DS, because the way JPA records subsistence, it includes night subsistence as well, the vast majority of that 20 million will be spent on day subsistence. So it's a not insignificant amount of money that the Army is spending every year on day subsistence. We also can't forget that our people are expected to pay for their daily food whilst they're serving in a unit. So let's say we've got a pay-as-you-dine unit. If you're purchasing your core breakfast, core lunch, and core dinner from the unit location, that's probably about £9 to £10 per day you're spending on food. And clearly, day subsistence isn't just free money. So it's on top of that money that you would be expecting to spend. So add that to the £25 current rate of day subsistence, that takes you up to about £35 per day that you would be required to spend to purchase your food, so that you're not out of pocket in comparison to being in your duty station. In terms of the current rate and how it's calculated, that's calculated by Defence Business Services, DBS, on our behalf. And we know that due to food inflation and just the wider cost of living inflation, that it should be more than the current rate of £25. But when it's abated by the daily food charge, actually it's not far off that £34, £35, and that would be expecting our people to spend. And probably just the final point to mention, there are some policy freedoms that exist already for people to exceed the current £25 daily limit, and that's all down to the local commander deeming whether or not there are exceptional circumstances where £25 is insufficient for people to buy their prepared meals for the day. An example of where that's been used recently was Op Kilkenny. So our people supporting border control in airports. Clearly, it costs a lot of money to buy food in an airport, and therefore, for the period of that operation, the commander requested, and it was granted, to exceed that £25 daily limit. So that explains a bit of context, a bit of background, and why the rate's currently at £25. And actually, when you take into comparison what you'd be expected to pay in unit anyway, isn't probably far off what our current food inflation prices tell us it should be.
That's great. Thank you for that. It's the context of also adding on what you would have spent had you been on camp, I think, is quite important, and it's probably something people don't consider.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Cameron. I think I guess another prime example in this case, it's taken us off the subject of DS, but as an example, when you're in an overseas location, and myself and Will have been visiting some of our overseas bases recently, and we talk about Local Overseas Allowance, which is the additional money you get when you're overseas to account for the difference in costs of living between the overseas location and the UK. People tend to forget that actually, let's say that you get £600 a month for LOA in the USA. They expect that £600 to account for their for their monthly food spend, forgetting that they would have spent £400 on food in the UK. So the difference is £1,000, and it's just a concept that sometimes is difficult to get your head around. But absolutely, you need to take into consideration what you would have spent anyway had you been in barracks, and therefore, the £25 is in addition to that spend.
Certainly, some much needed context, and it is difficult to get your head around it. You mentioned there is the LOA, or Local Overseas Allowance. Why was that scrapped for Op CABRIT?
Well, Cameron, I'll take this one. I was quite closely involved with the discussions on that one.
So you're to blame.
I was quite vocal on this. I'll go back and give you some context about why Op LOA was introduced. And if you go back a few years now, it was the in-theatre team had staffed in a really good piece of work in order to highlight the deficiencies in the deployed welfare package that our troops were unfortunately experiencing at the time. And therefore, that is when an operational rate of Local Overseas Allowance can be granted, as long as the Tri-Service and head office agree that it's applicable. So the evidence was built back in the day, and as a temporary measure, Op LOA was introduced for those on CABRIT. The concurrent activity that was supposed to happen over the years was an improvement to the deployed welfare package for those in Estonia. Now, stand fast the COVID-isms that occurred and the delay in those improvements. The latest stock take, and that's what happens when PGHQ assess the connect, entertain, sustain elements of the deployed welfare package. If they meet muster and they meet the evidence base, then the operational rate of LOA is either reduced or removed. And the current rate when they were doing their latest stock take was 69 pence a day. And in conjunction with the lock, so this was in conjunction with those people that generate and organise this deployment, the evidence wasn't sufficient to keep an operational rate of LOA ongoing. And the issue you have here is 69p a day can be seen as an offensive amount to give people when perhaps arguably the Local Overseas Allowance was being generous in the first place. And what I mean by that is those on Operation CABRIT have a wrap around them which the connect, entertain and sustain elements of the deployed welfare package shield them from their exposure to the local economy up to a certain level. And I understand the arguments, and the Army Sergeant Major and I receive a lot of feedback about, the expensive nature of some of the local shops, whether it be to do with shampoos or shower gels or whatever it may be. The BFPO and the ability to send items out to that operation is an example that they will use when they're looking at the stock take of this DWP, and therefore if it's reasonable to assume that service personnel don't need to constantly interact with the local economy, then an operational rate will be removed or reduced. And so that decision was not part of the single services at the time. That was taken by those who do the stock take at the DWP. And it actually occurred, ironically, on the day the Chief of Defence people went to visit the troops in Estonia, and that was obviously met with some anger, justifiable, because the communication to the troops was not given in advance. It was a decision that was made and perhaps not communicated in the most effective way. So CDP himself ordered another stock take check just to see if we're absolutely on point here, and that stock take occurred again, and it was removed with effect at the 1st of May because the evidence just wasn't there for an operational rate of LOA. And I think it taps into something a bit deeper, Cameron, to do with CABRIT, in that those that are on that operation are entitled to LSA at whatever level that they are currently on, and it maybe opens a wider discussion about whether that is sufficient for people who are going on 1, 2, 3, 4 rotations of this particular operation, because it's non-medal earning. It doesn't attract operational allowance. Yes, it attracts a bit of council tax relief, but it asks us the wider question as the Army team on what we can do in head office to influence is to try and see if we can make CABRIT more attractive as an incentivization to actually go through the rigmarole of CABRIT over and over. So that's the backstory in the context of Op LOA. Absolutely not my fault. I'll clarify that right up front. But I can see the logic of why it was given, and then I can see the logic of why it was taken away. But this is another good example of once people get used to a certain element and you take it off them, which, you can stand behind your policy desk and say all day long at the front of 752, it says don't financially plan, allowances and expenses can chop and change and be deleted at any time. When you're on the receiving end of that deletion, it still feels pretty rubbish. So whilst I understand people in this building made those decisions, Colonel Ian and I now look at what can we actually do about CABRIT. Is there something else more appropriate that could? And so that's our next bound of work, Cameron. So yeah, hopefully a good answer.
Yeah, that is really good. It's good to hear you're kind of working on perhaps other avenues to compensate the, who is out there, because I did CABRIT 2 and CABRIT 4, and it was very much I'm doing my job, but in Estonia, as in terms of the daily routine was exactly the same. Wake up fizz or wake up breakfast fizz, down to the tank park, maintenance, and then finish by 5, and then I'm sat in the block kind of all evening, and all I'm getting for that is LSA. And it was, it just didn't seem as, you're at the time, CABRIT 2, I think, was 8 months. So you're 8 months away from your family. Obviously, you get your R&R. But, yeah, LSA and then no medal at the end of it. And, it's good to hear you're trying to look at other avenues, because I think there is certainly scope there to try and incentivize or, increase the compensation that comes with being away for that long in a foreign country, for sure.
I think you raise a really good point. The language you've used is vitally important. If people are listening, is what is the appropriate level of compensation for that time away, and then that particular part of the world, and under those certain circumstances, because it is an extremely important operation, and the UK's commitment to NATO and our presence there is probably going to be enduring. So what do we do about it as an organisation? LOA is one of those contributory allowances when you have to mitigate against local prices and your exposure to that economy. Now, it's clear that LOA, a simple reinstatement based on emotion would be inappropriate, or to introduce something new in LOA for those people would still be inappropriate. But what do we do that could be appropriate? And that really is the conversations we're trying to spark here. But we'll see what happens in a difficult financial climate, Cameron.
Just some clarification there. It's just something I thought of there. So I joined after the Herrick days. Was So you're mentioning Op LOA. Did people in Afghan when deployed, did they get LOA?
They wouldn't have got the operational rate because the deployed welfare package
Was-
would have been there, but they would have got operational allowance, which is significant over a 6 month period.
Yeah, of course. I was just wondering, like, if I suppose we're so used to, especially those who, quite new joiners, like within, since after the sort of Herrick days, we're so used to, I suppose, you go to different countries to train, like Canada, and you get LOA there, but that's because that's not an op. So I suppose there's that the difference between like your LOA for like going to Canada, or used to be going to Canada to like BAS, to then actually going on an op.
No, yeah, you're right, and I think it all comes down to it. We try to resist the temptation of comparing one commitment to the other, but it's human nature to do so. You think you're on something in Batis, which is slightly less threatening, potentially, than how we view Operation CABRIT. But if we take that Batis example on, let's say, a winter repair or a decent amount of time there, you are going to have elements where you're either on exercise and you can maybe given an exercise field conditions rate, or if you're still on your temporary duty and you are out and about in the local economy, then you probably get the temporary rate. It can then seem harsh if you do the direct polar comparison that in CABRIT, under a DWP wrap with very, very little forced exposure to the local economy, LOA wouldn't be appropriate. But again, Cameron, this is where people just, not saying it's right or wrong, but they look at their salary packet at the end of the month and do a direct comparison, and they think, well, hold on, I'm under more duress here, arguably, than I was in Batis, but I'm receiving less money. And it comes down to that. We have a set of allowances to contribute against a set of circumstances, but then it still begs that question about compensatory appropriateness for CABRIT.
Yeah, I mean, that's lovely. I think we'll move on from LOA, and we'll get on to home to duty and get you home. We mentioned it briefly earlier. So when was it? During the pandemic, and that fuel prices shot up. Did home to duty and get you home, did the compensation, did that go up with it?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Really good question. So when we talk about home to duty and get your home travel, what we're talking about there is the commuting allowances. So together they're known as the two commuting allowances, both to get you from your home to your duty station effectively, but two different nuances to them. So home to duty provides a contribution for travel from your resident work address to your duty station, whilst get your home travel provides financial support to travel from your duty station to your privately maintained property, your PMP. So a slight different nuance to home to duty and get your home travel. Home to duty, think those that are travelling from their home location within 50 miles of duty station to their place of work daily, whereas get your home is more those weekly commuters. If I was to kind of sum it into two big buckets. The rates for both of our commuting allowances are reviewed annually, published in allowance policy, and there's been a steady increase in line with inflation over the years. However, as you kind of alluded to there, post-COVID, we saw a big rise in inflation across the UK, cost of living crisis, and if we remember back to the price of petrol at the pumps was probably looking something like £2 a litre for most of us who are filling our cars up. And as a result of the increase in fuel prices, ongoing cost of living pressures, there was a decision to raise both commuting allowances by 7%, and that kicked in with effect 1st of August 2022. So broadly in line with inflation rise of commuting allowances. I think really interesting where we find ourselves now. I mean, we all fill our car, don't we? And it's probably about £1.50 a litre now. So, it's dropped pretty significantly since that peak back in 21, 22. And I guess there's an argument now, do we review the decision to rise, to raise the commuting allowances by 7% and potentially reverse that? So it's back in line with the fuel costs. Now that's something that we don't support as an organisation, and we're trying to justify the reasons why it should remain, why the 7% baked-in raise should remain. But I think it's just an interesting context of some of the discussions we're having in head office. That whilst it's easy to make the argument to to increase rates in line with inflation, when it comes around to the discussions of potentially decreasing rates, the impact then on our people is slightly more problematic, isn't it? And therefore, we do our best to try and protect our people in that space where we can. But those sorts of discussions are going on in the head office at the minute, and we're working hard with the other services. Thankfully, both the Navy and the RAF are completely aligned to our thinking, and we're very keen to try and keep that 7% baked in going forward.
Well, I mean, that's good to hear. Hopefully people will be happy to hear that. Hopefully no soon-to-be reduction in it as the prices of fuel have gone down. We could have spent so much more time on this topic, but hopefully you've all gained something from hearing what was said. My biggest takeaway was Op LOA with regards to Op CABRIT. We are all so used to receiving LOA when we go abroad for training exercises, etc. And so many of us are guilty of expecting it when we go on ops, because we know no different. Hopefully, after that talk, you now understand the difference between LOA and Op LOA and why Op CABRIT no longer receives it. It is good to hear that they are looking into how else they can compensate those who deploy there, because I think it's needed. I didn't word it exactly how I wanted to during the conversation, but spending 8 months away from your family in a foreign country and the only extra financial benefit you receive is LSA isn't really fair compensation in my opinion, nor does it incentivize people to want to deploy there. Thankfully, they do seem to agree. The next and final episode is on the topic of pensions. Make sure to give it a watch when it comes out in a couple of days. Let me know down below what you thought of this and if we should do some more. Thank you all for watching. If you liked what you just saw, please hit the subscribe button up there. And if you want to see some more videos, click over there. See you soon.